Hi, my name is Rob Morgan. Welcome to the ABA podcast. Today I am joined by Stuart Rubinstein, the CEO of Akoya, a company that's helping make it easier and safer when consumers share their financial data. Stuart, thank you for joining me.
Rob, thanks for having me today.
Excited to have you, and I think this is a really timely topic. There's a lot happening in this space as we see sort of banking become more digital. Consumers are engaging with their banks very differently and often sharing their data with other groups that are helping provide new services. Can you talk a little bit about how the ecosystem's changed and how consumers are sharing and using their financial data today?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Rob. Our mission at Akoya is to transform the way consumers provide access to their data with increased security, privacy, and control over their information. The reason we're doing that is because the way consumers have traditionally given third parties access to their data is by sharing their bank login credentials, typically their IDs and passwords. And they did this because they wanted to use fintech apps, right? There were great apps out there that do everything from helping consumers send money to their children or their babysitters. There are apps to help apply for mortgages, to do your taxes, or do complete financial planning. So those are all great services to use, but the way that data has moved from a regulated bank or other financial institution into those apps has been broken. Right? Number one, the sharing of credentials, right? We all tell consumers don't share your credentials, and then to use these apps, the first thing you have to do is share your credentials. Well, that's broken to begin with. Two is, over the last 20 plus years, the cyber environment has changed dramatically, right? Cyber criminals have emerged. There are people who unfortunately will use those credentials if they can get their hands on them for nefarious reasons. There are better ways to do this. And third is consumers may not know all the players in the ecosystem. What I mean there is when a consumer wants to move their data from their bank into one application, often those apps use an intermediary, a third party called a financial data aggregator. If I can just walk through the steps for a second, the way that would work is a consumer might put their ID and password into a payments application, for example. That payment app, which is probably used to send money to their kids, babysitters, right, things like that, friends to split the check. That payment app would then give that ID and password to a middleman, a data aggregator. That data aggregator has all those connections and goes and uses those credentials, typically at the website or a mobile app of a bank, scrapes all the data that's available, and then gives a portion of that data back to that app where the consumer sees it. What the consumer doesn't know, and it's buried somewhere in the terms of service, is that middleman, that data aggregator, is keeping a copy of that data, and typically more data than the consumer is even seeing in the app that they're using. So the goal at Akoya is to fix that, is to make it so consumers don't have to share their ID and password, and that we can limit the data that's moving to only the data that's needed to perform the function that the consumer wants.
That's great. And so as you think about doing that, what are some of the challenges in moving away from that sort of screen scraping model that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, there are several challenges, but most notably is there are literally thousands of fintech applications and a good number of data aggregators. If each bank wants to move away from the current screen scraping method, that's how the current method is known, where those third parties use those credentials or the apps themselves do it, and they want to enter into a new advanced relationship, typically that's done by entering into a contract with those third parties, with those data aggregators or those fintechs. Well, now think about it. We have thousands of banks in the United States, potentially thousands of fintech apps, a large number of data aggregators. If each bank needs to contract individually with each and every one of those, it's not scalable. It's not feasible. It really can't be done in any economical way for almost any bank, even from the largest to the smallest. It's a network problem and demands a network solution.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I imagine that's even a bigger challenge for the community banks that often probably don't know who's even accessing their systems to start with and where to start in sort of building out relationships to make that data transfer more secure, but also give consumers better control over it. Can you talk a little bit about how Akoya is helping solve that problem?
Yes, and let me talk about it from a large bank down to a community bank as well. Akoya is solving the problem by creating what we call the data access network. The data access network is that Akoya will enter into, we call it a network agreement. Akoya will enter into an agreement with each party, whether it's a data provider. That data provider may be a large financial institution. In the case of a community bank, it may be the bank, but it's more likely to be the core provider to the bank. So that way we can scale it for all of the smaller institutions. So it may be the bank's provider. Now we enter into those agreements on one side. We call those the data providers, those who hold the data today. At the same time, we're entering into agreements with what we call the data recipients. The data recipients could be a direct fintech. They could also be a data aggregator. Data aggregators, besides collecting data, add a lot of other value to the data. Sometimes they categorize it and normalize it. For if you're analyzing spending, right, you can get the various spend from whether it's a DDA account or a credit card and normalize it all together so the consumer can see it better. By having one network switch in the middle, which is what Akoya is providing, we eliminate the need for every party to negotiate individually with every other party on the network.
That makes a lot of sense. And again, I think is something that community banks can really benefit from. As we said earlier, is such an important step to making sure that we can adopt these technologies that are more secure, but also give consumers that sort of affirmative control over how their data is being used.
Yes. And Rob, I'm sorry, I just want to make one more point there as well. We also solve the privacy piece of it. So while Akoya sits in the middle, Akoya, unlike the traditional data aggregation that goes on today, Akoya does not keep a copy of the data. Right? Matter of fact, we don't know who the particular consumer is, so we're not building a shadow database of, or copy of every consumer that every bank has. We are strictly a pass-through. We pick up data and we deliver it. Think of us like the post office, or maybe the way the post office is supposed to work. Right? The post office picks up a letter, delivers the letter, and then it's gone. Right? The post office doesn't open up the envelope, unfold the letter, scan it, right? Keep a copy of the data, do analytics on it, aggregate it with other people's data, and sell it to third parties. Right? We'd have a revolution if that's what was happening. Right? But that is what happens in traditional data aggregation today. We have to get away from that, right? We have to protect consumers and protect their privacy. Akoya was started as really a utility for the industry to move data securely and safely from point A to point B, but eliminate any store in the middle. So we don't see it, we don't do anything with it, and actually after we deliver it, we just delete it. We never have it. There's no big database of it anywhere. Very different than how it's worked before.
And that privacy component is so important. I think there's so many banks that are really eager to help their customers share their financial data in areas that will let them access these new tools and services. But they also feel a responsibility to make sure that customers aren't unknowingly giving away sort of the keys to the kingdom in terms of both security, but also privacy. So, the ability to solve for that is so important. And it's probably also why the CFPB is looking into this space. The CFPB has just announced that they are doing an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, an ANPR, on Section 1033 of Dodd-Frank, which gives consumers the rights to access and share this data. I think what you've shared today highlights how much has happened to help facilitate this. Stuart, I'd be curious to get your view on how the CFPB can engage in this space to help promote these sort of industry-driven solutions that are solving this problem for consumers today.
Yeah, I think the Bureau has done an excellent job of understanding data aggregation and the issues related to consumer data access. I've been meeting with the CFPB, I guess, for over 4 years now on this issue pretty regularly. I don't know necessarily that the CFPB needs to implement any specific rules around kind of the basics of data aggregation, but I think industry is doing that pretty well. There's a group financial data exchange that has set some standards that has representation from many different constituents, if you will, in the ecosystem, banks, core providers, card networks, data aggregators, large fintechs. So I do think that that's working well. I do think that holding all parties to the same security standards is critically important. Banks and other financial institutions are held by their regulators to very strict security standards, right? We also have Bramley-Bliley that we all comply with. I say we all, I came from a financial institution. I'm now, I guess, in this tech spin out.
Yeah, and of course the supervision that ensures that's being followed as well.
Exactly. But, when the data moves from there to a tech company, to a fintech, right, which is really a tech company, we should have the same security standards. It's the same data, right? It's still the consumer's private financial information, right? It needs to be treated the same way wherever it is. And if there's a problem, if someone, causes harm to the consumer or to another player in that ecosystem, right? So something happens down the line and it causes the consumer to lose money in their bank account. I'm very straightforward on this. Very simple to me. Whoever causes that harm needs to make the other party whole. Right? So if you cause the consumer to lose money, you pay the consumer. If you cause the bank to lose money, you pay the bank. Whoever causes harm needs to stand by that. And I think that's an area where the Bureau, could and probably should get involved.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I know there are a lot of people having these discussions right now, and hopefully the Bureau will take your advice. Stuart, thank you very much for joining us today. I know I'm smarter on this issue because of the few minutes we've spent here together, and I think our members are as well. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Rob, my pleasure. Thanks for having us.